right, thanks for joining me, everyone. Welcome to the program Liberty's Lions is the name of the book, The Catholic Revolutionaries Who Established America. Dan LeRoy is my guest. Dan's a historian. Dan, thanks for joining me.
Just thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here.
All right, so, we actually don't know a lot about Catholics' involvement in the American Revolution, mainly because the predominant religion at the time was Anglican and Episcopal, as they call it in America. And of course, in New England, we were Puritans, and in New York, I think they were more Dutch Reform. And um, the Catholics didn't have like that kind of a foothold in the New World, in the English colonies, of course. So you went into a pretty deep dive with regard to Catholics and their involvement in the American Revolution. So give us a thumbnail, if you will.
I will. And actually, what you said is a great way of getting into it. The numbers will tell you that in colonial America, about 24 to 30,000 people were Catholic, and not all of those people were patriots. So it's very easy on the basis of those numbers, which represent something like less than 2% of the colonial population at the time. It's very easy to dismiss the contributions of Catholics and say, look, how important could they have been? But among those 24 to 30,000 colonial Catholics, we have folks who weren't just patriots, but were actually leaders of the patriot cause. We have people who were leaders militarily, leaders economically, leaders intellectually, and of course, leaders spiritually. And that is the story that I'm trying to tell here.
Oh, okay. And also, I think it's John Carroll is the most famous Roman Catholic. He was the founder of Georgetown University. He was Maryland, which had originally started out as a Catholic colony under Lord Baltimore. And then I think that, I don't know the history exactly, but I believe that the Church of England went in and they smashed the seal, right, and they took over. But it's named after the Virgin Mary. It was started out as a Catholic colony. I don't know if Catholics were there in population in Maryland at the time, but talk a little bit about the Catholic community itself in colonial times leading up to the Revolution.
Well, Maryland is really the place to start. As you say, Maryland is a colony that is founded on the promise of religious liberty, and it has a Catholic founder. But even from the very beginning, in the first couple of boatloads of people who came over to start this colony, Catholics already are outnumbered. So the promise of religious liberty in Maryland sometimes is just a promise, and it is not always fulfilled. And as you just mentioned a minute ago, the history in Maryland, the 150 years or so before the Revolution, is really the history of gains and then retreats. And even in Maryland, this colony, again, that's founded on the promise of religious liberty, Catholics, by the time of the Revolution, they're second-class citizens all the way. They can't vote, they can't hold office. If they want to have their child receive a Catholic education, what they have to do is put their child on a boat and send them across the Atlantic. And when you think about it, and you think about putting a 10 or 11-year-old kid on a boat, very dangerous sea crossing, you may never see them again. Even to do this, they had to pay an exorbitant amount of tax, 100 pounds, just for the privilege of sending their kid on this very dangerous, possibly fatal trip. So that's Maryland. That's where things generally are good for Catholics. So if you take that and look at the other colonies, Pennsylvania is really the only other place where you can say that religious liberty for Catholics has any kind of foothold. And in Pennsylvania, as I mentioned in the book, the only two places where prior to the Revolution that you could attend a public mass in the entire British Empire are in Philadelphia, Old St. Joseph's and Old St. Mary's. So every place else.
Rhode Island have, I mean, it was founded on the principle of religious polarity and freedom, and it's also the site of North America's first synagogue. But there was no Catholic presence there, or was that not the case?
The Catholic presence in Maryland really is the same as it is in most of the other colonies. It is underground. And you mentioned Father John Carroll. Father Carroll had a chapel that he built on his property. It was a private chapel where he celebrated Mass. But Father Carroll was also, like a lot of the other Jesuits at the time, he was a circuit rider. And for most of the Catholics in the colonies, the way that you were able to celebrate Mass was, if you were lucky, a circuit riding priest would come around once, maybe twice a year. Uh, and the folks who are mentioned in the book, as well as Father Carroll, Father Ferdinand Farmer, Father Pierre Gabault, these are guys who kind of brought the faith to people on a very, very limited basis, but they were the flame keepers. They served people in private chapels. They served them outdoors. They celebrated Mass wherever they could celebrate it. It was really an underground thing in every place but Philadelphia.
Wow. And also, I think there might have been another reason why they were circuit riders in that being an open, unabashed Catholic priest probably did not sit you well with the authorities at that time. So you kind of wanted to keep moving around to avoid any kind of too much attention brought to you, I would guess.
That's absolutely true, especially in New York, where if you're caught once as a priest, they threw you out. If you're caught twice, you're put to death.
Wow,
So
that's unbelievable. You wouldn't know that this was going on in the American colonies at that time. And, I suppose it's a reflection of what was going on in England at that time, where there was really a very intense anti-Catholic reaction under the Cromwell government, the parliamentarians, and then you had a brief restoration with, I think it was Charles II, who was apparently secretly Catholic himself, and then he had to leave, and in order to keep his head on his shoulders, literally,
what
and he basically was allowed to retire. And then his daughter Mary and her husband William, with the Glorious Revolution, they came in and they formally and forever implemented the Protestant Church in England, and
I
that was
think
a
the best, oh, sorry. I was just say, I think the best number that reflects what you're just saying is we just mentioned that the colonial Catholic population is less than 2% around the time of the Revolution. In England at that time, it's about 1%,
right. And
at
there was
least
also a
who
great deal,
people who would publicly admit to it.
and there was also a great deal of cracking down on Roman Catholics in Ireland at that time. That was a really very tough story to tell, especially under Cromwell, where you had forced colonization and literally, I suppose you could say, programs of starvation, and with certain tactics of farming and whatnot, and that was also the beginning of the Irish Rebellion, which was inspired by the church in a large degree, maybe similar in manner to the eventual rebellion of Poland against communism in the 1980s, when Pope John Paul II gave his famous mass in Krakow, and which resulted in the largest gathering of people in world history for one event. It was over 1 million people turned out, and that was the end of communism in Poland. So the church was both a religious force but also a political force, and that's what I think most threatened the British authorities.
Well, and I would just add to that, since you bring up Ireland as well as England, and three of the figures who are mentioned in this book in particular are Irish Catholics who came to America specifically because of this crackdown that you speak of in Ireland. In fact, there's a great quote from the biographer of one of these guys, John Barry, who was the Commodore who's thought of as the founder of the American Navy. And the quote, and I'm paraphrasing, but only a little, is, the authorities in Ireland at the time John Barry was a boy, if they could have made sunshine illegal for Catholics, they would have done it. Everything, just about everything else was illegal at the time. And these guys came to America. They came to Philadelphia in particular, which was a port that received a lot of these Irish Catholics. And John Barry, as well as Stephen Moylan and Thomas Fitzsimmons, all Irish Catholics who became military heroes in the Revolution and were also big contributors intellectually and, in the case of Fitzsimmons, economically as well.
Right, and I think I know there's a pretty famous statue in Chicago over by the Loop, which shows George Washington holding his two hands out on with his arms around two men, one of whom was Father John Carroll, and the other of whom was Chaim Solomon, who helped finance him during the revolution and who was openly an open Jew. And the idea of this was to show that he had embraced these two religious minorities during the revolution. How accurate is that? I mean, what was Washington's attitude toward Catholics and not to mention Jews during the revolution?
Washington gets a chapter in Liberty's Lines because he really is unlike all of the other founders. If you think about the attitudes of the founders about Catholicism, you can kind of view them on a continuum. On one end of the continuum, you have folks like Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, Samuel Adams, who are pretty openly and publicly anti-Catholic. Moving along the continuum, you have someone like John Adams, who is puzzled by Catholicism and kind of skeptical of it. Then you move over and you find Benjamin Franklin, who is very circumspect in at least in airing his views publicly. In fact, there's a quote in the book where John Adams talks kind of enviously about Benjamin Franklin. He says, paraphrasing again, but the Catholics all thought he was a Catholic and the Quakers all thought he was a Quaker. John Adams didn't have that gift of Franklin's to be all things to all people. But the one guy who is different is George Washington. And that's because not only is he tolerant in word, he extends that tolerance to his deeds. And a good example of this is when he takes over the Continental Army in 1775. There's a tradition throughout the Northeast known as Pope's Night. And sounds like a fun Catholic evening, but it really wasn't. It was actually the opposite, an excuse to get drunk and burn the Pope in effigy. And when Washington takes over the Continental Army, he says, look, we're going to put the kibosh on this because we cannot expect our fellow citizens who are Catholics to join our cause if we're going to publicly insult them. And he did put the kibosh on it. And Catholics never forgot that this was a guy who didn't just talk the talk, but also walk the walk. And Washington later kind of extended that hand of tolerance to folks of all faiths. And it's probably one reason why Catholics for a long time have wanted to claim Washington. And we get into that a little bit in the book, and I don't think the evidence is really there to support it. But what I do think the evidence supports is that this idea that we've had for a long time of Washington as this kind of disinterested deist who didn't have any particular beliefs at all, I think that's wrong. I think there's a lot of evidence to show that he was, in fact, a person of fairly deep and profound faith, even, I would say. So he's different from these other guys.
I mean, he was a devout Christian. And I mean, I've been a student of John Adams, and Adams wrote in his fantastic things in his diary about how America was very religiously diverse. And he mentioned several religions that he came across in his travels. Says nothing about Catholicism or Catholics. It's all about Baptists and Methodists and other groups. So, I mean, he's silent on the question. And I think maybe also it occurs to me as you talk about Washington that Washington was a great diplomat. And, he was allied with the French king, Louis XVI, who was a Catholic king, and who was sending money and sending aid. And he sent his chief aide-de-camp, Lafayette, the Marquis Lafayette, who was a Catholic, and who served with on Washington's side in the war. So, there might have been a political and diplomatic side to his attitude there.
I think there was, and I think, there's a quote in the book from the great historian Joseph Ellis. And again, it's a paraphrase here, but he mentions that of all the founders, they all did things better than Washington, certain things, whether we're talking about John Adams or Jefferson or Hamilton. But he goes through the whole list and he says, but Washington had something that the rest of these guys all lacked. And they all acknowledged that he had this quality that all of them lacked. And he doesn't really specify what that quality was exactly. It's kind of left abstract. But I think one of the things is kind of at least I try to get at it in this book. I think his faith was unlike that of a lot of his fellow founders, and he kind of gets lumped in. You know, we know the stories about the Jefferson Bible and how he pretty much cut and pasted it together. John Adams certainly has a pretty skeptical view of things, and that's reflected in his letters to Jefferson and other people. Washington has been a little bit more mysterious, and I think maybe we haven't dug deeply enough into the mystery of what that is. But I think that's the other side of Washington's character too. Is if you think about a guy who might have realized early on that one day he might be the leader of a nation, he might have realized early on that to be that kind of leader, you had to practice the kind of tolerance that he practiced. And I just think it's a funny thing to talk about George Washington and say, like, hey, I think he's actually underrated. I think he actually
Yeah,
is, even today.
men in history. I mean, and yeah, he was tolerant. I know that on the front lawn of the Toro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, there's a letter that Washington wrote as president to the synagogue saying that we find comedy and alliance with the Jewish people, and that we want to, welcome them into the society of American citizenship. And it's an incredible letter. It's very moving. And the synagogue published it. They bronzed it and they put it up, in the big plaque so everybody could see it. And I think that he did exemplify that attitude, and in a sense, by doing that as president, he established that principle in a way. He did a lot of things as president that we don't give him credit for. Um, and some of them may even seem trivial, but he did set a tone that I think every administration and that the American culture has tried to adhere to ever since. Now, you also write about um, the Catholic attitude towards slavery at the time, which of course was the big controversy then and always has been, and in many ways still is in this country. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, the way that I think it's described in the book is that Catholicism and slavery in the colonies kind of have this conjoined history. And it's a painful history in a lot of ways, because one thing we have to acknowledge is that Catholics, including some of the folks who are mentioned in this book, they were slaveholders. And to be a slaveholder, and we're talking about individuals, and we're also talking about the Jesuit order, which had a lot of slave labor. To do that is a thing that went against the magisterium of the church. And that was something that goes centuries back. So, in doing what they did, we have to acknowledge what they did was wrong, and it contravened the policy of the church that in which they practiced, and the church that they represented. And I think uh, there are certainly examples of people in this book. Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who was a major slaveholder, made some attempts later in life to try to get slavery abolished in Maryland. He wasn't successful. And on the one hand, you can give him credit for that and say, look, he recognized that it was a thing that needed to be done with. On the other hand, and I tried to deal with this more in the endnotes of the book, uh, could he have freed all his slaves? It's possible that he could have done that. He would have taken certainly a significant economic hit, but I don't think we can just let him off the hook. And I think the I guess the way to sum it all up, or the way that I tried to sum it up in the book, is to say, being slave holders doesn't mean that the people mentioned in this book weren't great men, but it does mean that they were less great men than they could have and should have been. And to me, I think it seems like the fairest way of trying to deal with this from a historical remove, which is the only way we can really deal with it today.
Right, we have to look at it also in the context of the times, and I think that in recent times, I think it was in the 1980s, Georgetown University actually paid reparations to specific black families that had been enslaved by the Jesuits during and that had enriched Georgetown University, which was an unusual thing, and which was an interesting development in that they took that kind of an initiative. I mean, obviously, you can't go back and change history, but there are ways to bring about some kind of a recompense in specific cases. So that's pretty interesting. I mean, the early, Lafayette was a great American patriot, and there were also some great Polish patriots like Thaddeus Kosciuszko, who was a general who served with Washington, and there's a statue of him and a rotary in my own town of Boston, and I think there's also a statue in Boston Common of him. Um, Talk about some of those figures.
Let me, I'm glad you mentioned them. And I think to kind of look at it globally, we were talking about numbers earlier and the fact that the amount of colonial Catholics was very small. However, when you factor in the contributions of all of the foreign soldiers who fought on the side of independence, and that's the French, of course, but also the Spanish, the Polish, the Germans, the Irish, there's an estimate given in the book, and we're never going to know this for sure, but it does make a certain amount of sense that as many as 70% of the soldiers who fought on the Patriot side may have been Catholic.
Wow.
And that's a number that when you look at that compared to the numbers we're used to hearing, it puts it in a completely different light. But the folks that you talked about, in particular, Lafayette, Kosciuszko, Casimir Pulaski, the father of the American cavalry. Uh, One thing that's interesting about all of these guys, especially the French and the Polish patriots in particular, is they were very successful in fighting for liberty here in America. When they went back home, it was a different story. And Kosciuszko and Pulaski at different times were unable to keep Poland liberated from Russia, or at least keep Poland from being partitioned. Lafayette and Rochambeau uh, had some initial successes in the French Revolution, but well, we all know how that turned out.
Reign of Terror, which was 50, an estimate 50,000 Catholic priests were executed, guillotined, and then of course in Poland at that time, they underwent the partition between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. They just sliced it into three pieces. So right. I mean, their successes after the war were not great. Um, what After the war, post-war, you have Washington as president. What were there changes in generally in American attitudes toward Catholics at that point? Did Catholics really start to assume their rightful place in a free society? I mean, did they have to worry any longer about being underground?
It's a great question, and it has really two answers. The first answer is in the short term, post revolution, it was really a period of relative calm in this brand new American version of the Catholic Church. And tensions with Protestants had kind of died down. Catholics, by and large, fought on the side of the Patriots, and they were accepted, I think, generally by their fellow Americans. And the nice thing about that was it really kind of gave this brand new church time to grow. So in the short term, yes, there was acceptance. Where that starts to change is once we get later into the 19th century, especially as we reach the midpoint, immigration starts to change everything. It starts to change everything.
Right.
Exactly. It,
American Party, which was headed up by former President Millard Fillmore, that was openly and quite virulently anti-Catholic. It was a reaction to Irish immigration in Boston, my hometown, where you had a convent that was burned with the doors locked, and you had some other terrorist type things against Catholics in Charlestown. There were several instances like that.
So that's the thing. Catholicism changes as a result of immigration. America itself changes, especially with this influx of immigrants from Ireland, as you say, from Italy, also from Germany as we go on. So the whole country's demographic changes. And as you point out, as that demographic changes, things start to get hot for Catholics again toward the midpoint of the century.
So, anyways, no, I mean, you're shedding some very interesting light on an aspect of American history. I like to delve into American history, particularly with historians. And I'm glad you're doing it. It's good
Well,
stuff.
thank you.
So, Dan, your book, it's published by Sophia Institute Press, Liberty's Lions. It's available at all major bookstores. It's available at Amazon Books. Do you want to let my viewers and listeners know anything about where they can get information about you or your work?
Absolutely. If you're looking for the book, you can get it directly from the publisher. That's sophiainstitute.com. As you mentioned, you can get it from Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all the usual online suspects. If you'd like a personally inscribed copy, or if you'd like more information about me and what I'm up to, you can visit my website, which is Dan Leroy. That's LEROY.com. I'll be glad to sign a book any way you like and ship it out to you. And if you want more information about me, book a speaking engagement. I love talking about this stuff, and I'm happy to get out there in person, virtually, however it is.
Excellent. Listen, Dan, I want to thank you for joining me. Let's do it again and stay in touch. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me as a guest. Again, it's a pleasure and a privilege, and I really enjoy getting to speak with you.